Paris and I went to the fashion museum there, which was really something. But I've never.
When we were in Paris, we actually went to a fashion show.
Did you?
At the Galerie Lafayette.
Oh, really? Which is one of the most beautiful shopping
well, what
places
fascinated
ever.
me is the models had attitude.
Oh, really?
Like, this was their space
That's
they were sharing with you.
That was funny. Yeah.
And you know, it's when someone's at the top of their profession, it's interesting.
Yeah.
And they knew that they were good. And they knew that they had
So they walked with swagger.
Oh, all of it. You know, chin out.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So can you see the clock?
Yeah.
Okay.
You take care of your stuff. I'll take care of mine.
I'll give you 5 minutes at the end. Okay.
Okay. So first we have the introduction. Hello, I'm Jim Schaefer, host and executive producer of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. My guest today is Heather Ann Thompson to discuss her book, Blood in the Water, the Attica Prison Uprising 1971 and its Legacy. Welcome to Rip Rap.
Great to be here.
The first question I reflected on this was, why did you call it Blood in the Water?
Oh, well, because actually it's kind of there's two meanings behind it. One is that it's actually a quote from one of the prisoners after the state retook the prison, and there is all this bloodshed and horror around him. He says that he looks up from all of this and all he can see is blood in the water. So it was from him. But it was also sort of in the back of my mind, I was thinking about the other sort of famous prisoner in this time period, George Jackson, and his writing Blood in My Eye, which was read by many of the prisoners. So it was kind of a dual meaning.
Oh, I did a little bit of research. There were movies out in 2016 about blood in the water. But it's just fascinating to get that. It's kind of a poetic phrase, really. It captures. And when after reading the book and reflecting on it, I found it interesting that you call it one of the most important civil rights stories of the last century. Mm-hmm. Why?
Well, ultimately, that's probably an understatement. It's actually probably one of the most important human rights stories, and I think I've started to talk about it more in that framework. But certainly in terms of civil rights, this is a prison that is a real reflection of the broader society. So it had a very disproportionate representation of both black and brown Americans, and certainly racial injustice was a big reason why the conditions there were so bad. And much of the protests that they launch is in a civil rights language. And it's also civil rights in the sense that even though people are incarcerated, they do not stop being citizens. They don't stop being part of this country. And so this idea that prisoners, so the most contained of our citizenry that has the least power, nevertheless has both civil and human rights, and this was what the core of their protest was about.
And a lot of people don't know the United States has the most people in prison.
That's right.
Of any country in the world.
That's right.
22 million.
Yep, nearly 100 million with some form of criminal record today because of that sort of long-standing, I think, desire to deal with all social problems through the criminal justice system rather than through any other means, right? Education.
Well, I've heard people argue that this was a political thing of taking away people's ability to vote.
Mm-hmm. Well, that certainly, it did have that impact, right? Which is when you're in prison, you don't vote, and increasingly with felonies, which many drug convictions are, you can't vote after you get out. So indeed, that was a political shift of power, locking up that many people.
And then there was the different drug wars and all that stuff, mm-hmm. where it was intended to stop the drug abuse, but it really ended up being a nickel and dime beggar, people who could get life in prison.
That's right. Really, after the story that I chronicle here, that prison buildup and that drug war really kicks off in high gear, and at least I try in this book to show the connection, that it's really because we get this story so wrong. We misunderstand so severely what happened back in 1971 in prisons that we go down this path of even more punitive policy rather than fixing the problems that led all those guys to protest in the first place.
I found there was one thing you brought up, that the New York State authorities only prosecuted prisoners and not the officials.
Right. So, well, the reason why this is so significant is that, I mean, just a little background perhaps for some viewers. This is a story of about 1,300 men who wanted basic conditions improved in the prison. Things like not having 1 square of toilet paper a day, or being able to have more than 63 cents a day to eat on. And when they launched their protest for essentially 4 long days and nights, it's a negotiated process, and it looks like it could end peacefully. But instead, the state of New York sends in extremely armed state troopers, and what happens is really a massacre. Now, afterwards, you would expect perhaps that the excessive law enforcement retaking, which led to 39 men being shot to death, both guards and prisoners, and 128 men being shot, and then these men were tortured. Perhaps law enforcement would also be held accountable, but that's not what happened. The state of New York, in fact, just went after prisoners after this. And so the book is not just about this civil rights protest. It's really about the 30-year the 30-year saga thereafter of protecting the police and really going after the prisoners for things that they did not do.
I thought it presented quite a challenge for you as a historian to untangle the thing about records. Mm-hmm. And you tell the story about some of the situations you got into, mm-hmm. and finding records and then coming back and they were gone.
Yes. So one of the reasons that folks got Attica so wrong, unfortunately, remains a problem today, which is that prisons are our most closed institutions, even though they are public, even though we pay for them, even though we trust them to carry out justice on our behalf as citizens. We have no idea what goes on in them. And so trying to write this story, I was really faced with that. The records are all sealed. The state of New York does not want digging into this story because, of course, again, there's no statute of limitations on murder, and the police kill a whole lot of people in this prison. So it was a bit of a cloak and dagger story at times for me, which was trying to get these records. And you're right, I did happen upon a pretty important set of records that I don't think anyone knew were there in a courthouse, and they were instrumental in me being able to tell the sort of behind the scenes of the cover-up and to name some of the troopers that had committed this harm. But then later, right before the book was about ready to come out, a reporter tried to find those same documents, and they all disappeared. Now, luckily, I have made copies of the most important ones of those. But yeah, it was really alarming to me to imagine that, my God, we finally have located some records and now they're gone again.
Well, I just thought in terms of the historiography, mm-hmm. of establishing record.
Yeah,
it was quite a challenge.
That's right. You can't often tell the stories that shaped American history, most importantly, because they're just kind of off limits, even to historians who are trained to dig for them.
It was a mess.
Yes.
As I was reading the book, I was thinking, man, this is one big mess.
Well, and that's how long it took me. I mean, I don't think historians normally take 13 years to write a book, but this book was a real challenge to simply figure out what had happened, who the players were, why this was a story that took place 45 years ago, but we're still talking about it. Even this year, the book is about ready to come out in paperback, and we still haven't seen all the records, so I'm still kind of pushing the state of New York to finally open those.
Just to pause. Why has it taken 45 years for a comprehensive history of the uprising to be written?
Well, I think it goes to this question of records. I think that there's been a lot of interest in Attica for years. I mean, there's filmmakers that have referenced it, like in Dog Day Afternoon. There's songs that reference it. But at the end of the day, the state often is the body that holds the records into public events. So if those records are not available, it's kind of hard to recount what happened, the story. So that's one of the reasons. And the other reason, frankly, is that the story wasn't over to write about. It wasn't until 2000 that the prisoners finally had some modicum of justice by telling their story in a civil courtroom, and it wasn't until 2006 that the surviving hostages had, again, their modicum of justice from state officials by way of a settlement. So in some respect, we couldn't even start this story and really tell it till it had had more resolution. Yes, well, it does bleed into, to the current situation, and that's why, it was funny, it was like a light bulb went off. I'm writing a story about an event that happens 45 years ago, and it begins to dawn on me, wow, well, it's after Attica that we start this massive prison buildup in this country. So why? What's the connection? So it really was an interesting historical exercise, but also constantly being impacted by the present. What was happening with police today, what was happening with prison today.
What was fascinating to me is it wasn't so easy to understand the roles of the people, prisoners or prison guards.
Right.
Because sometimes they would switch, or it was a mess to figure out what was going on and why it was going on.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's also why I try hard in the book to write it more like a narrative, so that 1 minute you are in a cell with the prisoners trying to understand it from their point of view, but the next minute you might be in the home of a prison guard trying to understand the situation from their point of view. Because the complexity, I think, is the key. This was an event that many parties contributed to in their way that led both to the most extraordinary civil rights protests, but also to one of the bloodiest conflicts between the state and the citizenry we've had, as someone said, since the Indian Wars.
Well, it's fascinating that people got involved sort of in a serendipity thing. I mean, it was their various interests in their personal life, so that's why they became a prison guard or a prisoner. Mm-hmm. And then as that unfolds, it gets worse.
Right. And you meet them, these figures in the beginning of the book, and you kind of follow them through to the end, and a lot of those lives that would never otherwise have intersected because of this one event, they intersect, repeatedly over 45 years.
Well, as you discussed, most of Attica's records were not sealed, so why couldn't they be used?
Well, that's really interesting. I mean, some of the records are officially sealed, and there's some complicated reasons for that I explain in the book, but the majority of them are not officially sealed. They're just under the lock and key of the Attorney General's office. So I did try to access them through Freedom of Information requests. And, with more or less success, the closer I got to really uncovering the trauma that happened there, though, I felt that the access to those records really dried up. And I think it's because, again, there was so much wrongdoing committed on the part of officials that nobody really wants to, no one wants to open
officials went all the way to the governor's office.
That's right. Yeah, the thing is that even if you're not from New York or you have no interest in New York, the book is a little, or at least it was shocking to me that everybody with power, right, from the lowest workman's compensation clerk to the President of the United States to the Supreme Court and the Justice Department, there's so many figures that could have done the right thing in this story that don't. So it's a kind of a stunning story of power gone wrong. On the other hand, as I'm sure that you noticed, there's also some incredible heroes and heroines in this book that are also unlikely. A local coroner who ends up standing up for what's right, or a whistleblower inside of the Attica investigation. So it's a funny tale of you have no faith at some level at the end of the book, and on the other hand, you're kind of surprised by the people that do the right thing.
But some of the officials, like Governor Rockefeller, had an active part in messing it up.
Yes. The ability to find some of those documents was the reason why the book is able to finally show that, for example, Nelson Rockefeller, it wasn't just a mistake that people got killed. I was able to show that he knew going in that they were going to kill hostages. And perhaps worse, and this is maybe to your point, afterwards he has a series of meetings in his swanky pool house of his estate with the same people that carry out the assault, and they kind of get their story straight. And so it is a little, it's disconcerting to realize how much that people with power corrupted this whole system.
I was also fascinated with the depth and breadth of your supporters. Because you really organized a whole bunch of people in a number of areas. And I think it'd be useful to talk about that.
Well, in what sense? Just to do the book, you mean?
Yeah.
Or? Yeah. Well, this goes to this question of the research. Because there was so little access, at least initially, to the research, I had to go to the survivors. And so I talked to many prisoners and guards and lawyers and judges and police officers and people who had been there. And the funny thing was, of course, that they didn't all see the story the same way. So I would often find myself saying to people, I can't promise to tell the story the way that you would. But I promise that I'll honor your story, because at the end of the day, it was all of their stories. And I have heard from some of the people that are in this book, and some of them have not even to this day been able to finish the book, because they knew a piece of it that they had participated in, but they didn't know the full story. And I think even people that had been traumatized and tortured in this place didn't quite realize how bad it was in terms of the full cover up, the full inhumanity of it.
I remember one image about a screwdriver.
Yeah. When I talk about Attica, I that story that you're referring to, I don't even, I can't even really talk about. There are acts of brutality in this book that frankly, they still haunt me. It was the hardest part of the book to write. There's only 2 chapters on the actual retaking of this prison, and they're relatively short. One is called No Mercy, and the other one is called And the Beat Goes On. And I would tell you that out of that book is 700 pages with notes, and those were the 2 hardest to write, because how do you use words, language, to fully convey what happened to people without anesthetizing us to it, without kind of making it gratuitous? And so some of those examples of torture that you're referencing, those were just, they remain just beyond comprehension. And then some of the things that actually don't sound that bad maybe ended up being the things that haunted me the worst. So for example, the troopers were, after fully controlling this place, they were taking people's eyeglasses and smashing them and taking out their false teeth, because many prisoners had dentures because the medical care was so bad they lost their teeth in prison. So a lot of them had dentures, and they would just throw them up in the air and smash them with baseball bats. And that's when, for me, even doing this research, I understood that this is, this is beyond ending a prison uprising. This is about degrading people and showing them who's in charge.
It's about power.
Yeah, it's about power.
So what was the impact on you as a historian from this experience? About power.
Yeah, it's about power.
So what was the impact on you as a historian from this experience?
Well, I think you can tell just the way I'm describing it. It was, there's much of it that remains haunting about it. I remain haunted by the question of whether or not I fully got it right. Meaning, I know that there's a lot of documents that I still haven't seen, and I hope that this fully captures the story or gets it as close as we could get to it right now. But I worry that there's more of this I should have been able to tell. I worry that I was able to convey just how bad this was. But it was also something that I couldn't walk away from, because at every turn the survivors made it clear that this had to be told. It didn't matter whether I was interviewing a survivor whose parent had been killed, or whether it was Tom Wicker from the New York Times who had been an observer there. I mean, everybody broke down at some point telling me this story. And that, again, kind of made me feel very, it was important to do the book, but it also raised the stakes, it felt, a little bit to get it right.
Post-traumatic stress syndrome.
Yeah. I mean, certainly Attica has made many people still suffer PTSD, and for me, I'm just simply the vehicle to tell the story, and it was pretty traumatic just to tell the story, so I can't even imagine what it was like to live this.
But you took more than just a reporting role, because you got involved with it and dug down into the depths.
Well, there's questions often raised about history and being a historian, which is, how much should you intervene in the story? And there is this idea that if you're a historian, you just simply, the facts, ma'am, nothing but the facts. And I can say with complete clear conscience that this book is driven by the research. It is driven by what I found. And there were things that I found that I didn't want to find. There were things I found that caused me to rethink what I thought. So it's definitely the research that drives this story, and that's why it has integrity, and that's why it is, it's not, there's no agenda behind it. But it's also the case that when you read certain stories, there is clear lines of right and wrong that become obvious to you when you write about them, and then in turn when you recount them to a reader. So, for example, if you write about slavery, right, you can make it legible to people, you can make people understand what all the parties were thinking when they were doing things, but it doesn't change the fact that slavery is immoral. To hold another human being in bondage is immoral. It is wrong, right? So there are all these ways in which you do become part of the story because the evidence takes you there, though, because you see some of this brutality and you comment on it, and therefore it becomes part of, you become part of the telling of that history.
But that's a more involved kind of history telling.
Well, it is, yeah. Well, it is, yeah. It is. I mean,
and you pay a price.
Yeah, I think so. But I think all one can do in that situation is to know in your heart that you really are trying to listen to all the parties, and that I think that people who might assume that this is always sympathetic to the prisoners, will know that when the prisoners do some pretty horrific things in this book, I tell that story too. And or assume that I would be anti-guard. I mean, I try to make you feel what those guard families felt too. And I guess the only characters in this book, historical actors in this book, that don't come off very well, no matter how you slice the cake, are these people with the most power, these state actors. They don't get their fingers dirty in that bloody water, but they certainly are the ones who could have stopped it, and they are certainly the ones who could have effected some form of justice afterwards.
And probably set up the situation
Right.
so that it unfolded that way.
Right.
And that's a pretty impressive bit of detective work.
Yes. Well, I'm most eager to see what happens. I think that the state of New York has been under some pressure after this book, and because of the survivors pushing them, to finally open the records. And I think that this is the first comprehensive history so far, but I really look forward one day to all these records being opened so that we can know even more. I suspect, for example, that there's much more connection here of the federal government than I was able to document. We know that this is a tiny town in upstate New York, tiny town, state prison, and from the moment this riot begins and the rebellion then takes off afterwards, the FBI is there, sending teletypes to the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the President, the Vice President, the Attorney General, and that was a hint to me that, wow, the 60s were a complicated, 70s a complicated time, and we don't even know the half of it yet till we get these records open.
More to come.
Yeah, I hope so.
Well, thank you for being in Rip Rap.
Thank you so much for talking with me. Kind of shocking part of it was I knew that the state had protected the police. What I didn't fully even bank on was how overt, how concerted the effort was. I was willing to believe going into this book that maybe it was just, look, turn the other way, blind eye kind of thing, right? We know that they did wrong, but we're not gonna pursue it. But they tampered with the evidence. I mean, they doctored photographs. They
doctored photographs?
Oh yeah. I mean, they there's this one famous photograph where this prisoner is dead. He's been shot and he's on the ground. And then there's another prisoner, and of course, or another photograph, same guy, and of course he hasn't moved because he's dead, but in this photograph he has a big knife in his hand. And they literally planted evidence. They scooped up all of the things in the yard that would potentially implicate police officers and buried it. I mean, so it was the kind of, even I couldn't quite get my head around the concerted effort that was made to protect the police. And it made me think about today, when you see these things on the news today about, these police killings and they say, well, there was no evidence. And, after doing this book, I'm like, well, no wonder there's no evidence because,
There's more to the story.
That's right, because people will work hard to keep it under wraps for sure. So, but thank you for
What
talking.
fascinated me was that it was such a mess.
Yeah.
And as a historian,